The most dangerous lie is not denial. It's later. On a cold January morning in 1991, inside a quiet recording studio in Montreux, Brian May believed he was doing the kindest thing possible. He wasn't thinking like a musician. He wasn't thinking like a producer. He was thinking like a friend. Freddie Mercury stood on the other side of the glass, thinner than anyone wanted to admit, leaning on willpower more than strength. This wasn't a performance day. This wasn't even supposed to be a vocal session. It was meant to be light work, safe work. Brian pressed the talkback button and spoke gently, carefully. Let's record it later. He meant rest. He meant tomorrow. He meant there will be time. What Brian didn't realize was that Freddie Mercury was no longer living inside the same timeline as everyone else in that room. Because for Freddie, later had already disappeared. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was final. In that silence, four men understood something they had been avoiding for years. This wasn't about music anymore. It wasn't even about survival. It was about choosing what you leave behind when time stops negotiating. And when Freddie finally answered, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't soften it. He simply told the truth. And that truth shattered everyone in the room. But that wasn't the whole story. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Freddie Mercury and Queen and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel, like, and share. Freddie Mercury didn't wake up one morning suddenly aware that his time was running out. He felt it creeping in quietly. First, in the exhaustion that no rest could fix. Then, in the illnesses that came too often. Then, in the way mirrors became optional. By the late 1980s, Freddie knew something was wrong long before anyone else dared to say it out loud. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. He did something far more revealing. He accelerated. Studio sessions became more intense. Ideas came faster. Decisions became sharper. Freddie wasn't planning albums anymore. He was compressing time. What looked like denial to the outside world was actually discipline. Freddie made a private decision that would define his final years. He would not slow down to accommodate fear. Doctors came and went. Names were never spoken. Labels were avoided. Inside Queen, there was no confrontation, only motion. Work replaced conversation. Creation replaced questions. And Freddie controlled the pace. Some days he arrived energized, commanding the room like the old days. Other days, he barely spoke, saving everything he had for the microphone. The band noticed the pattern but respected the silence. Because asking the wrong question would force an answer none of them were ready to hear. Freddie understood something brutal. Once the truth is spoken, time changes shape. So he chose to live before that moment. But knowing the end is coming doesn't make creation easier. It makes it heavier. And it changes what you choose to say. By the time Queen entered the studio to work on The Miracle and later Innuendo, there was a rule that no one had written down, but everyone followed. Nobody asked. Not Brian. Not Roger. Not John. They all knew something was happening, but acknowledging it would break the fragile balance Freddie had constructed, so they adapted instead. Sessions were scheduled around Freddie's good days. On bad days, the band worked on instrumentals, arrangements, or mixing. No complaints, no pressure, no sympathy allowed to become visible. This wasn't avoidance. It was loyalty. Inside the studio, Freddie was still Freddie Sharp, demanding, sarcastic, playful. He pushed the band harder than ever. If anything, the urgency made him more precise. But outside the booth, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Brian May later admitted there were moments when he wanted to stop everything, to say something, to ask if they were pushing too far. And every time, he didn't. Because Queen wasn't just a band. It was a family operating under an unspoken agreement. As long as Freddie wants to work, we work. That pact held them together until Brian wrote a song that made silence impossible. A song that didn't hide behind metaphor. A song that said exactly what none of them were prepared to say out loud. The Show Must Go On did not begin as an anthem. It began as guilt. Brian May wrote it alone, late at night, with the quiet awareness that he was watching his best friend fade in slow motion. Every line felt personal. Every lyric felt dangerous. My soul is painted like the wings of butterflies. My heart is breaking. This wasn't poetry. It was observation. When Brian finally played the demo for the band, no one spoke. Roger Taylor later said it felt like the room physically changed temperature. John Deacon quietly left. Everyone understood what Brian had written and who it was for. And that created a new problem. Because the song demanded power, range, control, everything Freddie Mercury was famous for. Brian began to doubt himself, not as a songwriter, but as a friend. Was it fair to ask Freddie to sing this? Was it cruel? Was it denial disguised as art? Brian even considered recording the vocal himself, not because he wanted to, but because he wasn't sure Freddie should. But deep down, he knew the truth. If anyone else sang this song, it would become commentary. If Freddie sang it, it would become testimony. So the band prepared everything else first: instruments, harmonies, structure. They left the most dangerous part untouched. Because once Freddie stepped into that booth, there would be no pretending left. And January was coming fast. Mountain Studios had always felt like refuge. Perched above Lake Geneva, far from the British press and the noise of London, it was where Queen went to breathe. Freddie loved it there. The quiet, the control, the illusion that time slowed down inside those walls. But in early 1991, time felt different. Freddie arrived thinner than anyone wanted to admit. His movements were slower, more deliberate. The mustache that once framed a defiant smile now seemed too heavy for his face. Still, when he laughed when one of Roger's jokes landed just right, the old Freddie flickered back to life. Only briefly. The sessions moved with an unspoken urgency. Every finished track felt like something rescued from the edge. Nobody wasted energy. Nobody lingered. There was a strange mixture of professionalism and restraint, as if everyone feared that acknowledging the moment would make it real. Brian watched closely. Not as a guitarist, not as a producer, but as a friend measuring time in glances. Freddie never complained. He never asked for special treatment. If anything, he pushed harder, as if momentum itself could keep him upright. But Brian could feel it, a quiet shift in gravity, the sense that each day carried more weight than the last. And now, everything was ready. The instruments were done. The harmonies locked. The arrangement complete. Only one thing remained: the vocal. And Brian wasn't sure the studio or his heart was ready for what came next. The control room was unusually full that morning. Not crowded, just watchful. Engineers lingered longer than necessary. Assistants found reasons to stay. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This session mattered. Freddie entered the vocal booth slowly, supported more by habit than strength. He sat for a moment, eyes closed, breathing carefully. Brian watched through the glass, his hand hovering near the talkback button. He didn't want to say anything, but silence felt like betrayal. Brian leaned forward and spoke softly, choosing each word like it might fracture. "Freddie, we can record this later. You need to rest." The sentence was gentle, reasonable, human, and the moment it left his mouth, Brian knew he had broken the pact. The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Through the glass, Freddie didn't react immediately. He didn't turn. He didn't nod. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of a word he no longer recognized. Later, Brian wasn't thinking about music. He was thinking about tomorrow, about protecting what little strength Freddie had left. What Brian didn't understand yet was simple and terrifying. For Freddie Mercury, later had already stopped existing, and the truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. Freddie finally turned. Not dramatically, not angrily. He looked straight through the glass, meeting Brian's eyes with a calm that felt heavier than panic ever could. He reached for a small glass beside him, vodka, his old ritual. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it, then steadied. He took a small sip and set it down. Then he spoke, quietly. "Darling, I don't have later." 5 words. No explanation. No anger. No negotiation. The impact was immediate. Brian felt his chest tighten, the air leaving his lungs as if the room had suddenly lost oxygen. Roger turned away. John stared at the floor, unable to look at either of them. This wasn't bravery. This wasn't defiance. This was clarity. Freddie wasn't refusing rest. He was refusing illusion. He stood, slowly but deliberately, and walked to the microphone. Each step looked like a decision, a choice made long before this moment ever arrived. He adjusted the stand, slipped on the headphones, and glanced back at the control room. For a split second, something familiar returned, a flicker of mischief, of showmanship. "Well then," Freddie said softly, a hint of a smile cutting through the gravity. "Let's do this, shall we?" And in that instant, everyone in the room understood. They were no longer recording a song. They were witnessing a farewell. When the red light came on, something impossible happened. The man who had walked to the microphone moments earlier, slow, fragile, visibly fighting his own body, disappeared. The first lines were intimate, controlled, almost conversational. Freddie's voice floated gently over the track, careful but focused, as if he were testing the space rather than occupying it. Brian watched in disbelief. This wasn't adrenaline. This wasn't muscle memory. This was transformation. As the song built, Freddie seemed to gather strength from somewhere no one could explain. His posture straightened, his breathing deepened. His eyes closed, shutting out everything except the moment in front of him. And then came the chorus. The part Brian had been most afraid of. The show must go on. The room froze. Freddie didn't strain. He didn't pull back. He expanded. The voice that filled the booth was not the voice of a man conserving energy. It was the voice of someone spending everything he had left intentionally. Engineers scrambled to adjust levels as the meter slammed into the red. Nobody cared. Nobody stopped him. 4 octaves of defiance poured into the room. This wasn't a recording session anymore. It was a statement. Freddie sang through the entire track without stopping. No breaks, no second takes, no compromises. When the final note faded, no one spoke. Because everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed something that should not have been possible. Brian May did not celebrate when the take ended. He couldn't. As Freddie removed his headphones and smiled that familiar, gentle smile, Brian felt something collapse inside him. 20 years of friendship, of shared stages, of triumph and chaos, compressed into a single, unbearable realization. He had just watched his best friend outsing his own body. Freddie looked through the glass and said lightly, "I think that was rather good." The room exhaled. Brian didn't. He excused himself quietly and stepped into the corridor, away from the equipment, away from the band, away from the moment. And there, out of sight, he broke. Not because Freddie had failed, but because he had succeeded. Brian later admitted that this performance haunted him, not as a musician, but as a human being, because no amount of admiration could erase the guilt of knowing what that performance had cost. Roger Taylor would later call it the bravest thing he had ever witnessed. John Deacon never spoke publicly about that day. And Brian has said he still cannot listen to The Show Must Go On without tears. Because every note carries the memory of a moment he wishes had never been necessary and knows could never have been avoided. Freddie Mercury knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't chasing perfection. He wasn't chasing immortality. He was leaving evidence. Evidence that he had not stopped creating. Evidence that he had not surrendered. Evidence that illness did not get the final word. The Show Must Go On was not recorded for radio. It was not recorded for charts. It was recorded for time. Freddie understood something most people don't until it's too late. When time runs out, intention becomes everything. Every lyric became a message. Every breath became a choice. He didn't sing about despair. He sang about continuation. And that's why the song still resonates decades later, not as a goodbye, but as a refusal. In the weeks that followed, Freddie continued to record whenever he could. He finished what needed finishing. He spent time with the people he loved. He faced the end without spectacle. When he passed later that year, the world mourned a legend. But inside that studio in Montreux, something else had already happened. A man had looked directly at the truth and chosen to sing anyway. And in doing so, he left behind something stronger than fear. Proof that even when there is no later, there can still be now. There is a moment in every life when time stops offering alternatives. Not tomorrow, not soon, not later, only now. Brian May believed he was protecting Freddie when he said those words. And in a way, he was. It was love. It was fear. It was the instinct to hold on to someone you're not ready to lose. But Freddie Mercury understood something deeper. Later is a luxury. Later assumes permission. Later assumes there will be another chance. Freddie didn't have that illusion anymore. So he chose to act inside the only space that was still honest, the present. He didn't rage against what was happening. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't ask for sympathy. He sang, and by doing that, he transformed a recording session into something permanent. Not a goodbye, not a tragedy, but proof. Proof that courage doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks calm. Sometimes it looks exhausted. Sometimes it looks like standing at a microphone when you could have asked for rest. Brian May once said that watching Freddie sing that song changed him forever. Not because of the notes, but because of the choice behind them. Because some people wait for later. And some people, when later disappears, create something that lasts longer than time itself. If this story made you stop for a moment, if it changed the way you hear The Show Must Go On, take a second to like this video. It helps keep stories like this alive. Subscribe if you want more moments where music reveals what words can't. And tell me in the comments, what Queen song feels different once you know the story behind it? Because some songs aren't just heard, they're lived.